You don't realize how bright it is up here till you're actually standing here. It's truly an honor to be here this afternoon to join the Patient Safety Summit. And I want to thank Joe, the Massimo team, and the Foundation for supporting this endeavor, and in particular, Paul Jensen for the work that you've done on the neonatal panel. About a year ago, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. Middle of the night calls are never good news. I was on call for pediatric cardiac anesthesia, but I rarely get calls in the middle of the night for heart surgery. So I braced myself for the worst and picked up the phone. It turned out to be a pediatric cardiologist on the phone. She wanted to alert me to a 2-day-old baby in shock being transferred from a small hospital in rural Kentucky. She thought that this neonate might have congenital heart disease and need emergency surgery. Now, until several years ago, I got these calls all the time, and the outcomes were not good. As you might expect, death and major organ damage occurs more frequently during middle of the night emergency heart surgery. Things have changed for the better since then. Technologies have emerged to help diagnose congenital heart disease before birth or soon after birth, and outcomes got better. Now, as you're going to learn today, pulse oximetry is a technology that can be applied to diagnose congenital heart disease in newborns within a few hours of birth to prevent the case that I just described. Unfortunately, all hospitals are not using pulse oximetry for this purpose, and so we continue to get the cases that I just described, albeit less frequently. As a result of this gap between hospitals that are using the technology and those that are not, we continue to see these cases. And as a result, we have unnecessary death and harm continuing to occur. This is the neonatal patient safety problem. Now, before I introduce our panelists, let me take a couple of minutes to review the significance of the safety problem of unnecessary death and harm in neonates. Let's look at neonatal mortality by country. In the US, it's 3.9 per 1,000 births. That's almost 4 times higher than Japan and nearly 2 times higher than Australia. In Japan and Australia, the neonatal healthcare system more reliably applies diagnostics and therapeutics that are effective than the system in the US. In other words, there's less variation among the hospitals in these countries than in the US. The performance gap is narrower. Now, if we want to decrease mortality in the US and improve safety, we have to narrow the performance gap among our hospitals. We have to get all the hospitals to use diagnostics and therapies that are known to be effective, regardless of whether it is in rural Kentucky or in Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Let's focus on two safety problems arising from these performance gaps. Not detecting congenital heart disease in a timely fashion, like the case in my story. The second, not keeping arterial oxygenation in premature infants with respiratory failure in the targeted range. How much unnecessary death and harm is occurring from these performance gaps? Congenital heart disease is the most common birth defect and afflicts about 100,000 neonates per year in the USA. Now, of these, 4,000 are born with what's called critical congenital heart disease, like the baby in my story. Worldwide, there are about 130,000 of these critical congenital heart disease babies born each year. If we diagnose critical congenital heart disease within hours of birth and administer appropriate treatments, we can potentially prevent death and disability in 2,000 neonates in the US and 65,000 worldwide. How do we do this? We use pulse oximetry, a very robust and inexpensive technology. Now, application of pulse oximetry to all newborn exams to detect congenital heart disease is what we're talking about here. Dr. Ann Granelli, who's one of our panelists, conducted the seminal study on using pulse oximetry to screen for congenital heart disease in newborns. She found in 39,000 newborns that pulse oximetry combined with physical exam can successfully screen for critical congenital heart disease and save lives. The sensitivity was excellent, about 83%, and better than the 63% from the physical exam alone. Her study has been confirmed by several other studies. Now, as a result of these studies, in 2011, the Critical Congenital Heart Disease Work Group, composed of the leaders in pediatric cardiology, recommended in Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, that pulse oximetry with motion-tolerant sensors that can measure functional oxygen saturation approved by the FDA should be used to screen all newborns in well-born nurseries and transitional nurseries. The American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, and the March of Dimes have all endorsed this recommendation. Now I would like to shift to the second performance gap, not keeping arterial oxygenation in prematurely born infants with respiratory failure in a narrow range. 2 weeks ago, I administered an anesthetic for a young child for eye surgery. This child was born very premature, and as a result of that, the lungs were not developed, and the child had respiratory failure, was put on a ventilator, and given additional oxygen for several weeks. Fortunately, the lungs recovered, the lungs developed, and the ventilator was discontinued along with the supplemental oxygen. But he developed retinopathy of prematurity and was visually impaired. He was now presenting for surgery to save what vision he had. Now, since the 1950s, we've known that oxygen is hazardous in premature babies. If you get too much oxygen or too little oxygen, you can get damage to the lungs, the eyes, or the brain. Now, for years, there's been a debate about what the target for oxygen is and how to reliably achieve it. Now, during the past few years, there have been 4 very large randomized controlled trials to determine the outcomes of oxygen targeting in premature infants with respiratory failure. These trials were conducted in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. These studies randomized premature infants to a targeted oxygen saturation within the first day of life. Now, this month, a meta-analysis of these studies was published representing nearly 5,000 premature infants, which indicates that targeting oxygen concentration to achieve a certain saturation by pulse oximetry can decrease death and certain complications. In summary, there is a safety problem from performance gaps in neonatal health care. The safety problem is unnecessary death and harm from hospitals not always using technologies and processes that are known to be effective. Examples of these performance gaps are the application of pulse oximetry to diagnose congenital heart disease and to target oxygen therapy in premature infants with respiratory failure. One hospital uses this, another does not. That is the performance gap that we must close. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists who will inform us some more about these 2 performance gaps and what is being done to close them. Thank you. The first panelist is an Associate Chief, the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care Medicine at the prestigious Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. He is expert in pulmonary physiology, respiratory failure, and congenital heart disease. He also has a funny accent. He hails originally from South Africa. Peter Cox, please welcome him. Our second panelist is Associate Professor of Pediatrics, the Director of the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit at Loma Linda University and the Children's Hospital. He serves as a leader on many of these panels that you see these recommendations. Please welcome Mitch Goldstein. Our next panelist is internationally renowned. She's a biomedical scientist whose entire career has been the research and development of technologies to diagnose congenital heart disease. She's conducted the seminal studies. Please welcome Anne Granelli. Our next panelist hails from Washington, D.C. She's the clinical manager for Congenital Heart Disease Screening Program. She's at Children's National Medical Center. She works where the rubber meets the road, folks. Please welcome Lisa Home. Next, we're fortunate to have the president of the March of Dimes here. She has worked her entire career advocating and raising money for prevention of birth defects. Please welcome Jennifer House. Finally, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our final panelist. She's the co-founder and chairman of the Newborn Foundation, or Coalition. This organization advocates and works to establish policies using technologies to improve health care of newborns. Annamarie Saarinen, please. So the point of my opening remark was that there are gaps in the healthcare system, and these gaps are responsible for the patient safety problem. Now, the first question that I usually ask goes to the president, somebody who sits up high, who can see the system and connect the dots. But we have quite a few presidents and directors here. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit on asking three people who are presidents and leaders who see this system from a different perspective. And that would be Jennifer, that would also be Mitch, and Annamarie. And so my first question to you is, sitting up high and thinking about the neonatal healthcare system, what are the performance gaps that we need to concentrate on closing?
Well, I think the first performance gap is that we need to concentrate on applying effectively and systematically what we know works. And that sounds easy, but it's tough. I think as far as the performance gap goes in birth outcomes in our country, certainly our unacceptably high rate of premature birth, we rank 131st in the world in premature birth, is very significant. In the impact in labor and delivery means that there are practices that we need to put in place. For example, the timing of elective induction and C-section. Mm-hmm. That needs to be governed much more closely because we're creating iatrogenic preterm birth. And then a lot more babies wind up in the neonatal intensive care. You have adverse drug events, which are preventable. And I think the other big area is the one that this panel is just filled with expertise about, and that is the less than perfect application of what we know how to do right in the newborn screening arena.
Okay. Mitch.
What I'd like to go back to is actually the idea behind work hours as well as handoffs and not missing or dropping information. This is something that I think is really so critical from a standpoint of neonates who are oftentimes at the very limits of viability to begin with. And when you think about it in the context of the newer technologies and the newer devices and newer applications that are available, it is so critical that everybody be on the same page and that everybody have a common template or common information to work from. And this is why, again, as we move forward and as we limit duty hours and as we try to become safer in terms of our application of the technology, this idea of having everybody having a common shared mental model is something that really has to come to pass.
Good. Annamarie?
Well, I agree profoundly with both of you. I'd say from our perspective, when we focus on policies and health disparities around newborns in particular, we try to remember always that these babies are being born at hospitals all over the place. And just like the U.S. as an example and not look outside that. But, they're the largest patient transfer population by percentage, not by volume, but by percentage, because if there's a problem with these kids, they are almost universally moved, and oftentimes more than once. So this idea of handoff communications stretches certainly from hospital to hospital, institution to institution, not just even between labor and delivery or a new baby nursery and a NICU. So these kids often go to one place to a NICU and then to another place if, say, they had congenital heart disease. Oftentimes the place that has the NICU doesn't necessarily have a heart surgeon or a cardiologist. So for now, I think one of the big performance gaps is in figuring out how you streamline that communications process to support care delivery, and using health IT is one of the important pieces of that, and telemedicine, of course, as well.
Now, two of the significant gaps that I talked about in my opening were in congenital heart disease and premature infants with respiratory failure. Let's first hone in on the critical congenital heart disease. So I'm going to begin with Peter, and then I'll follow up with Mitch. But Peter, what is the consequence of not diagnosing congenital heart disease promptly?
Thanks, Dean. I think you alluded to this in your opening statement. When you get a call at 2 in the morning, that's invariably because a child has, as to use the common parlance, crashed either at home or in the emergency department, and they then end up in a sort of spiraling downwards of multiple organ dysfunction, which affects every organ in their body. If one can detect this early enough, before you actually reach that stage, you present the surgeon with a child who is in a far more physiologically stable milieu. Mm-hmm. What we know is that surgery itself causes a cytokine chaos, and if one can prevent this being additive rather than being isolated, you will actually improve the outcome of those children.
And Mitch, you're in the neonatal nursery. You've handled many of these kids through your career.
I think what's interesting is to look at the contrast in terms of where things were when I first started and where they are now. And going back 20 years ago when I first came out and was a brand new neonatologist, the way these babies presented was ad extremis. There was not a sense that we had an understanding that these babies would be born at a predictable interval. There was no screening test, nothing that could be universally done to predict them. Yes, we had physical exam. Yes, we had antenatal ultrasound. But these did not pick up all the cases of critical congenital heart disease. I am reminded of a time going back, at this point, almost 18 years ago, when at that time I had a prototype of a device that could read through motion and through low perfusion. And we did, and again, albeit ad extremis, diagnose through pulse oximetry a baby with critical congenital heart disease. And this, I would say, for me, was the beginning of an understanding of what really was possible through use of a technology, through use of something that would allow screening and prevent the progression to the extreme, prevent a lot of heartache, a lot of sadness, and to give parents of these children a chance to have these children go on to grow up and to really be productive members of our society.
So Anne, you've devoted your career to developing technologies, initially echocardiography, which has become the gold standard prenatally and postnatally, and lately pulse oximetry to use to diagnose and prevent some of these problems that Mitch and Peter were talking about. How did you get started with pulse oximetry for this purpose?
Well, I worked at one of the 2 pediatric cardiology centers performing surgery in Sweden. And my colleagues, they identified this problem. They had a feeling that more and more babies came in with a circulatory collapse. So they did a retrospective study and proved it. So the 3-year period between 1999 and 2001, 28% of babies with life-threatening congenital heart disease were discharged without a diagnosis. So I was most often one of the persons doing the echo on the baby when they came in, collapsed, and I felt really strongly for these cases. And we thought maybe pulse oximetry is a tool to prevent this, and we started from IDing the problem to see how to deal with it and to test these results prospectively.
I hope you'll notice that a lot of these innovations came from phone calls and work at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we saw this picture, Anne, of a baby laying there with the pulse oximeter on them. How is this actually done? Can you run through that a little bit for us?
It's very quick and simple, provided that you have proper equipment and trained staff. So our first study concluded that you cannot use any pulse oximeter. It needs to be able to read through motion and low perfusion. So that is one of the criteria for success, because we compare different oximeters. And then we developed a protocol. We compared a cohort of normal newborns with a large number of babies with CCHD and came up with an optimal way to separate these groups. So basically, you put the sensor on the right hand and look at the saturation, and then you test the either foot, and you look at the difference between hand and foot. It shouldn't be a big difference. And you also look at the saturation value. It shouldn't be too low. So there are two criteria, either a hand-foot difference or if it's too low.
And when do you apply this? How soon after birth can this be done?
Well, the recommendation from US was that it should be done after 24 hours of age. In our study, our median age was 38 hours. However, we had early discharge, so babies as young as 6 hours of age were being screened. And I have to say that even if the recommendation is 24 hours, if a baby are being discharged before, it's important to do it before discharge.
Okay. So Lisa, you've been working with the doctors and nurses at all these hospitals to try to get them to use pulse oximetry as a screening device. Identifying cyanosis can be difficult in newborns, okay? So why is identifying cyanosis in a newborn so difficult?
So I think what pediatric cardiologists used to say is just, why can't you just do a better assessment in the newborn nursery? And what we now know is that the human eye actually has a blind spot to cyanosis. And so the cyanotic blind spot refers to the difference between a normal, healthy baby's perfusion level, which in a newborn nursery, it should be 95% or higher to 100. And when a doctor or nurse will sort of raise the red flag and say, there's a problem, this baby is not pink, this baby is not well perfused. And so that difference, the human eye can really start to detect cyanosis around 80%. One study showed, and this was a study done using doctors and nurses who are trained in clinical assessment, and a lot of them didn't recognize the blue discoloration around sort of the lips and nose area, the cyanotic indicator, until the baby was on average 69%. So there is a big difference where the human eye literally cannot see the cyanosis. And so that's why pulse oximetry screening is so important. It gives the doctors and nurses one more tool to be able to say that this baby is not at a healthy, pink, well-perfused level.
And we just heard from one of our other speakers that there's a health disparity, that African Americans, Hispanics, and other people of color don't have as good of outcomes, health outcomes as others. Is there a difference between the ability to detect cyanosis in somebody of dark skin versus light skin?
Well, actually, I think that's where technology really helps us, because what we found is that, our human eye is not really able to make that distinction, no matter what color the baby's skin is. It's very difficult to detect cyanosis just by looking at a baby. If that baby falls into the sort of 80% to 95% range, where a lot of these cyanotic birth defects, that's what the baby is in, and then that's where the baby is before the baby changes from fetal to newborn saturation. So it's very difficult to detect regardless of skin color, and pulse oximetry really helps with that.
Okay. So Anne, you've traveled the world and been involved with pulse oximetry screening in a bunch of countries, Sweden, India, Europe, etc. And these all have different healthcare systems. So how many babies are being detected with pulse oximetry screening in these countries who would otherwise be missed?
Well, I don't have specific data from each country. I can tell you about the research, and that has been confirmed by UK and Sweden and others. And in a non-screen region, you would miss up to 30% of the babies with critical congenital heart disease. And those babies with critical congenital heart disease are roughly 1 to 2 per 1,000 babies born. And that's same around the world. And if you don't screen them, 5% of them would even die before diagnosis. So using the screening, and that is an additional tool, just like Lisa said, that first you have the clinical examination, then you sometimes have fetal echo, but adding pulse oximetry significantly improves the gap. So we found that the risk of leaving newborn nursery was reduced until 8%, and that has been confirmed by other studies from UK, from Germany, and even one unpublished large study from China. So that is the goal we expect if we do this screening.
Good. Now, as we all know, it is difficult to get doctors and nurses to apply technologies. Change is difficult for anybody. And so, Annamarie, you've been at the center of legislative efforts to try to force the issue to apply a technology that's known to be effective. What is the status of it now in the various states? Who's using it now, and who is on the launch pad to use it?
Sure. Well, I just wanted to add something to what Anne said first. The pediatricians, and there are probably some in this room, are a tough nut to crack, because Lisa's very right about this blind gap, but I don't know that I talked to more than a handful of pediatricians back in the day when we first tried to get this added to the newborn screening panel that wouldn't look me in the face and say, there is no way that I would ever miss a baby with a critical heart lesion under my care and send them out under their normal physical exam. And all I could respond to that was to say, I'm very, very happy for the babies in your care, but please know that there are a lot of other physicians out there, not all of them are pediatricians and they're general care docs, that are, because we have this statistic, and the statistic wouldn't exist if everyone was like you. So that's part of the story we had to go with when we went to the legislatures and to the state departments of health. And not every state required legislation to make this happen, by the way. It can be statutorily added to their panel through their state Department of Health's Newborn Screening Committee. But right now, we were at 9 states fully implemented in the middle of last year, and 33 states have now passed legislation or statutorily added this screening to their newborn screening panel. The bulk of those will be implementing throughout this year. So for anybody who was here last year, and I said we went from 0.03% to 11%, and I was super excited about that. And I said in a year, I think we're going to be at about 25%. Now we are at 35% of newborns in this country being screened today, and this year we will be at 80%.
So when do you think we'll get to the tipping point? Are we already there?
Oh yeah, trains left the station. I mean, it's been such a privilege to work on this issue because it has had such a profound impact in such a relatively short period of time. And people know me, I have the patience of a gnat. So when I go after something, it's like, 12 months to wait for something to be implemented is painful because I'm the one who gets the emails from the mothers and the fathers who, were discharged from the nursery with a baby they thought was healthy. So I think the tipping point's there. The challenge is on the implementation side, the things that Lisa's working so diligently on, that Anne continues to work on, who, by the way, if anybody can't tell, is just, everyone here is a rock star, but this woman seriously has changed the world with her work, so I'm just so grateful to know her.
Yeah.
But I think one of the challenges in terms of the tipping point is the smaller and rural hospitals. So when you talk about disparities, don't think about it as just the kids that are of a minority, a racial minority. Think of it economic minority and a geographic minority. So these are the kids in rural Minnesota that, when we talk about 50% of babies being diagnosed prenatally, there's 25% in rural Minnesota. So you talk about these rural areas, that's where the gap exists because there's fewer that are diagnosed prenatally. That means more are going to come into the world without that. And pulse ox is an extra measure to help close that because otherwise, again, the kids are less likely to be detected in that nursery.
So you mentioned that operationally, the implementation is now where we're at. And so I'm going to turn the question over to Lisa, who you suggested. She's where the rubber meets the road. What challenges have you seen implementing these policies?
So there are definitely challenges, but I think one of the important things to focus on, which Annamarie just stated, is what's working. And I think the most exciting thing about what's happening in Washington, D.C. is that we, as of very recently, October of 2013, all hospitals in Washington, D.C. are now screening for critical congenital heart disease without a mandate. So it's not the law in Washington, D.C., but it's a real testament to the commitment of the doctors, the nurses, the D.C. Department of Public Health, of technology companies, and parent advocates really coming together and saying, we're going to get this job done. And we've done that. As of October, they're all screening. So the question about challenges, yes, there have definitely been challenges as well. I think one of the challenges lies in the false negatives and reporting of false negatives. False negatives occur in very low numbers, so it really takes joining together and looking at the data at an aggregate level, so working with DC, with Maryland and Virginia, and looking at, from the state population level, why these false negatives are occurring, and coming together and saying, this is what we can do about the problem. And especially in the cases of, we've just this year started looking with Maryland, Virginia, and DC at false negatives, and a lot of them are the coarctation and the interrupted aortic arch, and really looking at what can we do to make sure that we're catching these babies, whether it's process or technology, or what innovations can we make. So that's one of the challenges. I think the second challenge that I really just want to touch on is the problem of interoperability and data exchange. And in the implementation that we've been doing in DC, I think a huge challenge has been that there is no good way to get the data from the pulse oximetry device to the child's electronic medical record in each hospital system, and then taking that data and efficiently and accurately transferring it to a state surveillance records, such as an electronic birth certificate or an electronic birth defects registry. So that has been a huge challenge, because right now doctors and nurses, busy clinical staff, are having to double document and in some cases triple document the screen results, which is a safety issue as well as being inefficient. So I would say that that's still a challenge.
So you have a newborn baby. The parents and the family are very excited to have that baby. What is their role in helping with the screening? What's the education that's going in with them?
So I think one of the easiest ways to really learn about something such as critical congenital heart disease screening and how easy and simple it is to do is to be able to be part of it yourself. So I'd be interested in hearing from Annamarie as well, but one of the things that we really recommend to hospitals that are interested in implementing is to really do the screen with the family involved so that they have an opportunity to ask questions and so that they can really partner with you in helping swaddle the baby and keeping it comfortable when you're performing the screen. And it really only does take 3 to 5 minutes. Another thing that we do, we realize that families are extremely overwhelmed. They've just given birth to a new baby. There's a lot of information being thrown at them. So making sure that we're telling them multiple ways and in a way that they can understand, because everybody learns differently. So making sure that we have information during their newborn tours, during newborn education classes on the unit, as well as written FAQs, both in English and Spanish and other languages, so that they can really take it home, and when they have a better chance to absorb the material, they can look at the details and sort of continue to follow up on that.
So one of the things that you mentioned, Anne, is the type of pulse oximeter is important. And so I'd like to ask just you to reiterate that quickly, and then ask Mitch and Peter, how are hospitals currently selecting their pulse oximeter? Are they aware of this important distinction?
Well, I think the key to the success was the improvement in oximeter technology. So we started by assuming nothing and compare different oximeters. And we realized that you need to have a motion tolerant oximeter that can read through low perfusion. And I'm so proud of the US national decision, and they really heard me out there at that meeting, and they said this is important, and that's why the FDA recommended or said that you need to relabel pulse oximeters to be used for this kind of screening. So I'm really thankful for that. That has helped a lot.
So then we turn it over to Mitch, and despite this recommendation, what's going on in the hospitals and how they're selecting the devices?
Well, it is a very interesting topic. And again, when people hear that it's important that they do pulse oximetry screening, the default is the lowest common denominator. So if a hospital has a contract with a particular oximeter in mind, they will tend to try to use that particular oximeter. This is just the default. But again, if you look at the way this was done, and you had the Kemper recommendation, and then you had the actionable item that was put into place by Kathleen Sebelius just weeks after that article came out, it was very clear that this had to be not just any oximeter, but it had to be an oximeter that was capable of reading through motion and low perfusion. And an interesting example of this occurred at a community hospital that I was working at, actually an affiliate of Loma Linda University Children's Hospital, where the default contract was one that did not include use of a particular oximeter that had the ability to read through motion and low perfusion. And yes, we had a very, very high rate of false positives. And in that sense, we had a situation where one of the cardiologists contacted me while I was on service doing a rotation and said, "What's going on here? Why are you having so many babies who we have to do echoes on? What's going on? We don't see this at the main hospital." So in talking to her and in troubleshooting this, we figured out that in fact what was happening is that it wasn't that the directed oximetry technology was being used, but the default oximetry technology, the oximetry technology, which was the oximetry technology that the hospital had chosen for all of its patients. All oximetry is not equal. And we found that out the hard way at that particular venue, changed over, and it resolved the problem. But again, it's very important that when you have a directive like this, that you use technology in a way that's appropriate, and to use the appropriate technology for the appropriate problem, in this case, the screening process.
So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. We're going to talk now about oxygen targeting. And I'm going to first ask Peter. You're kind of an expert in respiratory failure. And we now have 4 randomized controlled trials and a meta-analysis. So what target are you using now?
I think if you go back and look at the context that triggered these trials, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of papers that came out and really focused on retinopathy of prematurity and long-term respiratory problems in children. ASCII is one of the papers that you mentioned earlier on, and what he demonstrated very nicely was that if you had a higher target oxygen, and he was above 94%, versus a lower target oxygen, which was below 91%, those with a higher target oxygen had both a higher incidence of retinopathy of prematurity as well as a longer requirement for respiratory and oxygen support. That triggered a number of different studies, of which there were in fact 5, done in about 5,000 patients, nearly 5,000 patients. And if you read these papers independently, the composite outcome was both mortality and neurodevelopmental issues, which included ROP. And in fact, they did not show a significant difference until they did look at a new algorithm that had been introduced midway through the study, and this impacted on 2 studies in particular, the Boost UK study and the COT study, which is a Canadian study. And the outcome from this suggested in the COT study that there may be a tendency to an increased mortality with low oxygen targets, that's below 89%, and the Boost UK study made it, in fact, showed a significant difference in mortality below 89%. The challenge, I think, is that these 5 studies all used similar targets. That's 85 to 89% and 91 to 95%. And I think you've got to choose whether you want a profoundly blind infant or you want a dead infant, because that's really what I think the extremes of both of those will lead to. If you get too much hypoxia, you're going to have an increased incidence of death and necrotizing enterocolitis. If you have too much oxygen, you're going to have an increased incidence of blindness. What the studies didn't look at was the bracket somewhere in the middle. And in a recent poll that I did of a lot of neonatologists in our city, there's still a group that targets a lower saturation below 89%, but I think most people would probably sit somewhere between the 2.
So I have just one more question left, and it's going to be to the person who we started this out with, and that's the person who's at the top, who can look at the big picture. And I'm going to look at you, Jennifer, now. You've heard all this discussion about the gaps, some uncertainty in the gaps. Where do you think we should go from here?
Well, I think in the newborn screening arena, we've got a great opportunity to save lives by dramatically improving sample collection and transport and rapid analysis. Right now, it goes to an off-site lab. I would envision a time in the future when perhaps all working together, we can have instant analytic capacity, cheap, instant analytic capacity right in hospital. And that would also usher in, I think, a new aspect of personalized medicine in the NICU and pharmacogenomics, so that adverse drug events could also be forestalled and prevented by having that same rapid, relatively inexpensive analytic capacity right in hospital. So I would see that as a great opportunity. Avoiding deadly delays in analytics of newborn samples and bringing the technology quickly to hospital.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all very much for this information and taking the time here to sit together and talk about things. Thank you.